All right, welcome back to Brain Part 1. We're going to do Lecture 4B now, where we're talking about the blood vessels and then putting everything together. So in 4A, we talked about the meninges, the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater, as well as the epidural, subdural, and subarachnoid spaces, the ventricles, which are fluid-filled spaces within the brain. We've got lateral ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, central canal through the middle of the spinal cord, and then the CSF, which is this highly saline solution that helps cushion the brain, floats the brain, and also helps clean out the brain. So in 4B, we're going to talk about the blood vessels and how all of these systems work together with a little bit of new information as well. Blood vessels. So every organ needs blood supply. That's just kind of how it works, right? Blood is our major transportation medium, so it's bringing oxygen, nutrients, glucose, amino acids, all of the things that cells need to take in to do their job and to survive. It also brings signaling molecules like hormones, and blood then, of course, also takes away waste products like carbon dioxide and other things. So all organs need blood supply to them and back away from them. So remember, arteries are what carry freshly oxygenated tissue that's coming from the heart, from the left side of the heart out to the body. And then those arteries branch into smaller and smaller arterioles and eventually the smallest little blood vessels, which are capillaries. From there, the blood drains into little veins called venules, and then larger and larger veins, and then eventually it goes back to the heart, and then out to the lungs to get freshly oxygenated back to the heart again, and then out through arteries. So hopefully you remember that from anatomy and physiology. So when we look at the arterial supply to the brain, there are two main arteries that are bringing our blood to the brain. So the major suppliers are the internal carotid arteries. Those are the ones in your neck. When you feel your pulse here, you are actually feeling your internal carotid artery bulge out every time your heart beats as a new wave of blood travels through it. So that is kind of the main supplier to the brain. But then we also have the vertebral arteries, which you see kind of posteriorly here, and they're called that because they actually travel up through little holes in the cervical vertebrae. So kind of crazy. Who designed that? Not me. I don't know why. So most of the blood to the brain is coming through the internal carotids. They are much larger than the vertebral arteries, but we also get a decent amount from the vertebral arteries. Now, what we're looking at here is something called the circle of Willis. So let me take you through this. So when blood comes through the vertebral arteries, here's one on this side, here's another one on this side, it comes together into an artery called the basilar artery, right there. So then you can see we've got this like traffic circle kind of thing on the base of the brain. So what we're looking at right now is the inferior surface of the brain. This is the anterior part of the brain up here. This is the posterior part of the brain back here where you'd find the cerebellum. So we're seeing this on the under surface of the brain, and we can see this kind of traffic circle. This is called the circle of Willis. Here's a diagram from the book. And so I'm going to switch to the highlighter. I think that works better. So again, here are our vertebral arteries. Down here, we've got blood coming in this direction, comes together into the basilar artery. And then we also have blood coming through the internal carotid arteries. And the openings to those are right here and right here. So they're also contributing blood to this traffic circle. So the incoming blood into this traffic circle, the circle of Willis, is coming from the internal carotids and from the basilar artery, which is where the two vertebral arteries came together into one single artery. So the basilar and the internal carotid arteries then are supplying this circle of Willis. And then we have three main sets of arteries that are taking blood out to the parts of the brain. So anteriorly, we have the anterior cerebral arteries right here. In the middle, we have the middle cerebral artery, right? And then posteriorly, posterior cerebral artery. So we have anterior, middle, and posterior arteries coming off of this traffic circle to send blood to all the different regions of the brain. This diagram is showing you the distribution of the supply from those different arteries. So in yellow, you can see I'm going to change to the pen. in yellow up here, right? So all this area of the cerebrum is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Look at this big area supplied by the middle cerebral artery, which you may have noticed was the biggest of all of them. And then all of this area back here, you can't see that. All of this area back here is being supplied by the posterior cerebral or posterior cerebral artery. I don't care how you pronounce it. From the arteries, blood is going to move into smaller and smaller arterioles and then eventually into capillaries, which is where then things can move from the bloodstream out into the tissues of the brain. But remember, in the brain, we have something called the blood-brain barrier. So over here on the left side, we're seeing a peripheral blood vessel, meaning not in the central nervous system. And in most of the body, capillaries are leaky. So a capillary wall is made up of these really flat cells. So like say this is a flat cell and it forms a little tube. Can I do this? No, I can't. Okay, there we go. So that's your capillary wall. And most of the time there's lots of leaky spots and gaps to make it easy for things to move in and out from the bloodstream into the tissues and from the tissues into the bloodstream. Remember, in the brain, it's different. So the brain is very VIP. It's very exclusive. It's going to be a lot pickier about what it lets in and how does it do that. Well, we already learned that there are these neuroglia called astrocytes that have these little projections here called end feet, and they kind of form a second layer around those endothelial cells that make the wall of the capillary. So now we have kind of like a double wall. The other difference is that instead of having these big open spaces in between the cells that are making up the wall of the capillary, in the brain we have what's called a tight junction. So the components of the blood-brain barrier, we've got the end feet of the astrocytes, we have these tight junctions between the cells that form the capillary walls, and then there are also these pericytes. So the pericyte is actually here, it's shown in red, so pericytes, not parasites like amoebas and stuff like that, but pericytes. Remember the prefix peri means kind of around the outside of, cyte means cell, so these are cells that are found around outside of capillaries. And what's interesting about pericytes is that they help maintain this blood-brain barrier, and what's also interesting about them is that some of the changes that we saw in people's brains with COVID infection seem to be due to disruption of the function of the pericytes, and made the blood-brain barrier a little bit leakier than it should have been, which is fascinating. From the capillaries, blood then, of course, drains into small veins called venules, and then into larger veins, and then the largest veins. Now, in the brain, for reasons that I don't know, the veins are called the dural venous sinuses. Now, the word sinus is used a lot in anatomy. It just means space. So we all think of like those spaces in our maxillary sinuses and our ethmoid sinuses. When you get like a sinus infection, it's just a space, it's a cavern, and so there are these spaces where the venous blood is going to be draining, and they called it sinuses. They're found within the dura mater. We're going to take a look at that a little bit later, but there are a few that I want you to know. So one is the superior sagittal sinus, which, as the name would imply, is on the top, and it runs right in a sagittal section right across the top of the brain there. And you see the yellow arrows are showing you the direction of blood flow. Then there's the, where's my thing? The straight sinus here, which is bringing blood also back to an area called the confluence of the sinuses. The confluence of the sinuses is just where the superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus come together. And then, so those were all single central structures. Then it splits out to the sides. So from there, blood moves into the, I'm going to switch to yellow, into the transverse sinus, one on each side, and then down through a somewhat squiggly one called the sigmoid sinus, and then that drains into the internal jugular vein. So those are the veins of the brain, and they're called the dural venous sinuses, or sometimes cerebral venous sinuses. It varies. Okay. All of those sinuses then, so we ended up in the sagittal sinus, and that drains into the internal jugular vein. So I'm going to do blue highlighter. So venous blood from the brain then is coming down into the internal jugular vein, which then drains into the brachiocephalic vein and then down into the superior vena cava. Here it is on the right side of the body coming down. Superior vena cava is then going to drain into the right atrium of the heart and then right ventricle out to the lungs, back to the left side of the heart, and then out through the aorta, completing the circle. Let's put it together and talk about how all of the things we've talked about so far work together. So remember the choroid plexus found inside the ventricles, and it is creating CSF from fluid and solutes in the blood. So arterial blood is coming into these special capillaries, which you can't see that, into these special capillaries down here. And then we've got our special ependymal cells that are going to be making the CSF and pushing it out into the space of the ventricles. And then their cilia are going to circulate it through the different ventricles, the aqueduct into the central canal. That's going to go around through the subarachnoid space. There are folds in the dura mater. This is new. We hadn't learned these yet. So the dura mater, that tough outer membrane, folds inward in the space between the two halves of your cerebrum, called the cerebral hemispheres. And that is called the falx, because the word falx in Latin means fold, the falx cerebri. So it's the fold between the two parts of the cerebrum. So falx cerebri. And then the other one that I want you to know is this one down here, which is a fold between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and it's called the tentorium cerebelli. So two folds of the dura mater that I want you to know that we're going to look for in the brains in lab. So the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. So they're important because they're really interesting and we're going to see them on the brains, but they're also interesting and important because look at these blue things here. Those should look kind of familiar to you. Those are the dural venous sinuses. Now you know why they're called dural venous sinuses. They're found in these folds of the dura. So I was really delighted to find this image. Let me orient you to what we are seeing. So this is a cadaver specimen. This is a posterior view. So we're looking at the back of the head, and the back part of the skull and associated tissues have been removed. So in this first one over on the left, so over here, let me switch to a pen. So over here is one cerebral hemisphere, over here is the right cerebral hemisphere. Let me erase that because that's pretty messy. Okay. So falx cerebri. This is that fold of the dura mater down in that space between the cerebral hemispheres. So there's your falx cerebri. Why won't it erase? There we go. And then here is the tentorium cerebelli. So right here is this fold where the dura, right, it was coming this way and coming this way, where it folds in and creates this separation between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So the other image is just a slightly more anterior section. So now we're kind of like into the brain. So again, here is the falx cerebri here, and then here's the, tentorium cerebelli here. Now, why am I so excited about this? Because you can see the superior sagittal sinus is in this spot right here. So there's that vein right there. And the transverse sinuses are in this little spot on either side. Oops, there's the superior sagittal sinus, sorry, on the other one. And then we've got the transverse ones you can see here. So I think it's just really cool to see how the venous sinuses are found within those places where the dura is infolding. The other new thing that I want to point out to you is that the superior sagittal sinus has these structures called arachnoid granulations. So this diagram should look familiar. It is what we used when we first started talking about meninges. And we now know the superior sagittal sinus. So I added that in here with an arrow. So there's our superior sagittal sinus. But there's something else I want to introduce you to, which are these arachnoid granulations. So these are these red, sorry, my pen is red, these little orange things that are projecting in. Now I want you to notice that they are in continuity with this subarachnoid space, right? See, it's like a little doorway. It's like a little doorway. Okay, so those are arachnoid granulations, and it's new. Here's a nicer picture from KenHub. They always do a nice job with illustrations. So here is my subarachnoid space filled with CSF, and then here's my arachnoid granulation, which leads out into that superior sagittal sinus. So what I've been leading up to is the fact that the CSF, which is constantly being produced and constantly circulating around, ends up moving from the subarachnoid space out into the superior sagittal sinus. And then it's in the bloodstream and it drains through the veins and it goes back to the heart and lungs and into the general circulation and gets dealt with by your body. So you're constantly making new CSF and you're constantly having the old CSF drain away into your bloodstream, so then it can be in contact with your kidneys and your liver, just one, and all those parts of your body that get rid of waste products for you. So here is again that picture. So from the CSF through those arachnoid granulations into the superior sagittal sinus, and then back through that venous system and eventually down the internal jugular vein and into the general circulation. So putting it all together, we've got arterial blood coming from the common carotid and then up the internal carotid into the circle of Willis, and coming up the vertebral artery, going into the basilar artery and into the circle of Willis. Coming off the circle of Willis, we have the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. Those are going to go into eventually into little capillaries. Remember the blood-brain barrier with the end feet from our astrocytes, the pericytes, those tight junctions between cells. And some of that is going to be made into CSF. It's kind of grayed out here, but we've got some choroid plexus in the ventricles, which is going to produce CSF. So now I'm going to switch to blue. Our CSF is going to flow through the ventricles, down through the aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, down the central canal, out into the subarachnoid space. And now you can't really see it because it's blue. And then eventually through those arachnoid granulations into the superior sagittal sinus. And then, of course, we have venous blood drainage. Where am I? Oh, I'm over there. Okay. So blood draining down the superior sagittal sinus into the transverse sigmoid and then down through the, that doesn't show up, down through the, here we go, down through the internal jugular vein. Pretty cool. So here's the summary for the whole lecture. So for the meninges, we talked about the 3 different layers, the subdural and subarachnoid spaces, and then I've bolded what's new, which is the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli, the CSF made by ependymal cells in the choroid plexus of the ventricles, which will cushion, float, and also clean out the brain. It circulates through and around and then empties into the sagittal sinus, into the venous bloodstream via those arachnoid granulations. So our arterial blood supply is the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries, which come together into the basilar artery, which all go into the circle of Willis, then anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries. Remember, the capillaries have the blood-brain barrier, and then the veins, we've got superior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, transverse sinuses, sigmoid sinuses, internal jugular vein. That's it. See you next time.